Hello, class. Mr. Fino here. This is Unit 4, Lesson 3 on daily life in ancient Egypt. So, in this section, you're going to learn how the social class of people affected their lives in ancient Egypt. So, this picture here, it shows this festival called the Opet Festival that happened every year in ancient Egypt. And when this happened, everyone in Egyptian society kind of got to go off work and partake in this festival honoring the pharaoh and the god Amun Re. And everyone participated in some way. Like the priests would decorate a statue with jewelry and put it in a shrine and this special boat called a bark. The artisans would build the bark. High-ranking officials would carry it into the water, and then farmers and peasants would watch the parade and the procession. So everyone got to be involved with this, which wasn't normal. Typically in Egyptian society, it was very separated. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. All right, so the first question we're looking at is, what was ancient Egypt's social pyramid? You can see here on the right. And it was based on the principle of Ma'at, which stressed the importance of truth, order, and balance. Kind of, I guess, people being kept in their place and knowing their place in society. So the social pyramid was ranked. Obviously, the pharaoh would be at the very top, government officials below the pharaoh, priests below them, scribes below them, artisans below them, and at the bottom you'd have peasants, which was by far the largest group. So at the top, very few people, and the bottom part of the pyramid, a much bigger group. So the first question here is, who was the vizier, or the vizier? I'm not sure of pronunciation, but they advised and carried out the commands of the pharaoh and hired and supervised government officials. So they're kind of like the right-hand man of the pharaoh, which you can see in the pictures here. This ancient Egyptian painting or artwork, you can see the pharaoh and their vizier. And then, if anyone's familiar with Hamilton, there's a song called "Right-Hand Man," so I thought that was relevant. And they also acted as a judge for the toughest cases in the kingdom, but they were expected to be neutral, meaning they did not take sides. Here I have Judge Judy. I don't know if you know Judge Judy, but she's a judge. And again, they're expected to be neutral in their rulings. Another government official was the chief treasurer, who oversaw the wealth of Egypt and collected taxes. So they oversaw money, essentially, and making sure that Egypt stayed strong in terms of their money. And people pay their taxes in things like grain, cows, cloth, and silver, because in ancient Egypt, they didn't have cash money like we have today. Another government official was the general of the armies. That kind of is what it sounds like. They advised the pharaoh in matters of war and national security, so making sure that ancient Egypt was safe. And he would help plan how to protect Egypt from invaders at their borders and establish alliances with other kingdoms. So the map here just kind of shows the borders of where ancient Egypt was. So they had to make sure that, on those desert borders at the sea, from the Nile, they had plans to keep themselves safe. And yeah, alliances in the center here and advisor on the right. What was life like for a government official? So what was their life like? So they lived lives of luxury, meaning very fancy, very comfortable lives. They had great wealth, fine homes, and lots of time to socialize, meaning, party and hang out with people. These families would enjoy lavish banquets with fancy food and the finest clothes. Honored guests would be able to sit in high back chairs while everyone else sat on cushions on the ground. And just by custom, by culture, people ate with their fingers at these meals. And during the meal, musicians, dancers, and acrobats would perform for the guests. The picture here on the left, this is not ancient Egypt, obviously. This is just showing kind of what someone that lives in luxury would live like today, with fancy cars, mansion. And then on the right here, this is not Egyptian food. This is actually Ethiopian food, which actually Ethiopia is not too far from Egypt. But I just put this picture here to show how they ate with their hands. And this picture here shows some art that was in the textbook, um, showing what a party might have looked like, how they were being, waited on by servants, and just living this really fancy, comfortable lifestyle. What was the role of priests? So, first you had the high priest who advised the pharaoh and oversaw all religious ceremonies. Kind of think of them as the head priest that was kind of on top. Um, there were temple priests who were in charge of temples around Egypt. Each temple was devoted to one or more gods, and it was the priest's job to take care of these gods, right? Probably by doing sacrifices and stuff like that. It was believed that the god in that temple lived in a statue in a room called the sanctuary. But before the priests could go into the sanctuary and perform their rituals and stuff, they had to purify themselves in a number of ways. So, um, you know, some of the things they had to do was they had to avoid certain foods. They couldn't eat fish. They had to avoid the lower classes. They would cleanse their bodies by bathing in holy pools 3 or 4 times a day. They had to shave off their body hair and their heads, like you see in this picture on the right. Um, they couldn't wear animal products because they were considered unclean, so they had to wear only linen cloth clothing. And so they had to do a lot before they could go in the sanctuary, um, which I think a picture on the bottom picture is a sanctuary. I think the god Horus, maybe, and the top picture here is just what a um, temple room would look like. And lastly, women could become priestesses, um, and they had very similar power to a priest, but they often oversaw temples devoted to music or dancing. So that, to me, that still sounds pretty limited. It sounds like they weren't given the full range of what a priest should be able to do. Next, we have embalming and burial, which is a huge part of what priests do. So Egyptians believed they needed to preserve bodies for the afterlife, a process called embalming. And the embalming process was complicated and involved many steps. So just I'm going to briefly talk about these steps. So first, they removed all the organs except for the heart because they believed it had an importance that was needed in the afterlife. They would weigh it by one of the gods to weigh whether or not they would be welcomed in. And they removed the brain with a hook through the nose, which is pretty gruesome. The organs that they took out were preserved in jars with a special salt called natron. They washed and oiled the body, wrapped it in linen, and spread a black, gooey substance over it. I imagine all part of the preservation process. The body was put in a sarcophagus, which is kind of like a fancy coffin, and they would be buried with all the items they need in the afterlife. Even the commoners would try to do some basic burial stuff like this and mummification, but the more advanced forms were reserved for the pharaoh and the upper classes. Here is a diagram of the process. I'm not going to read through all this because there's a lot of words here, but I'd like you to take a minute and look through this and read it. So how did boys become scribes? So only boys could become scribes. Girls could not do it. And they went to school with priests for 12 years learning hieroglyphics, which you can see some hieroglyphics here on the left. They would have learned 700 hieroglyphics, eventually writing it on papyrus, which was an early form of paper. So before they were able to write on papyrus, they had to write on other less fancy forms of materials. And school was very difficult and lasted from dawn until sunset. So think when the light comes up, they start until the light goes down. And students could be beaten if they were lazy or performed poorly. So this picture on the right, I don't know if anyone's seen the movie Matilda, but there's a character, Miss Trunchbull, and she is kind of a teacher. She just is crazy. And I highly recommend that movie, Matilda. What did scribes do? So they could do many different jobs. They would record the food supply, keeping track of grains and stuff. They would perform they would count the population, which is called the census. They would write and calculate taxes, record court cases and laws, and they kept track of military supplies as well. I think they kept track of death totals as well in battles. Scribes used sharpened reeds for pens with ink and papyrus for writing. I think I read that a fancy tablet that they would write on, kind of like you can see on the right, that had little spots for their ink, red and black ink, that they would be able to dip their pen in and draw with. And they carried their materials with them everywhere they went in a sling over their shoulder and bags for their materials. So they whenever they're and if they were traveling, they had their materials on them so they could do their writing. Who were the artisans? They were the highly skilled laborers and created some of Egypt's remarkable art. But unfortunately for them, they actually received little respect. They were seen as little more than laborers, even though they did these just beautiful things like um, you can see the Sphinx here would have been built by artisans, and art like this on the right would have been um, created by artisans as well and artists. Some of the artisan jobs included carpenters, jewelers, leather workers, metal workers, painters, potters, sculptors, and weavers. But probably the most skilled artisans were the stone carvers that created statues, engravings, and bas relief art. So they helped equip the temples and tombs with the statues and art for the afterlife. So think any statues you see or paintings or bas relief on a temple would have been created by um, uh, these stone carvers. Here I have an example of bas relief, which you can see it's very detailed art carved into stone. What was life like for an artisan? So they were kind of in the middle. They were the middle class, and they lived in modest homes with their families, not tiny, not big mansions, but kind of in the middle. They would work together in workshops, like you see here on the left, sometimes for 10 days straight without a break. Obviously that they'd be able to sleep and stuff, but um, very high expectations. Artisans depended on their employer for food. So if food was low and their employer didn't have it, they would often go hungry. And the pharaoh would call on big groups of artisans to work on their projects because, again, they had the skills that were needed to do those things. Last group are the peasants. So, who were the peasants? They were by far the largest group in ancient Egypt and supplied the kingdom with food. Right, they were the farmers, but they would also work on pharaoh's projects when they weren't working on their crops. The life of a peasant depended on the seasons of the Nile River. So, during the flooding season, when the water flooded over and created that good soil, um, peasants actually worked on the pharaoh's building projects because it wasn't a time for them to work on the field themselves. During the planting season, they sowed their fields with seeds. So they would actually work in pairs. One of them would use a plow being pulled by a cattle, which would kind of loosen up the soil. And then the second person would scatter the seeds over the soil to eventually grow. During the harvesting season, men cut down the plants with sickles, which is kind of like a curved blade that they'd use to cut the crops. And they would often, again, work from dawn until dusk. So much like the scribes, they just worked all day. And what was life like for a peasant? They lived in simple mud brick homes with little furniture, kind of like you see on the right, maybe something like this. Their diet was very simple. They ate onions, cucumbers, fish, and bread. Some were able to eat peas and lentils, and they very rarely ate meat. That was reserved for the more wealthy people. They were able to have they didn't have much time for fun because they were so busy working all the time. But they would actually play a river game where they would knock each other off papyrus rafts, like you see here in the center. They'd stand in and try to knock each other off, which sounds kind of fun. And if a farmer could not pay their grain tax, they could be beaten, which is pretty rough. So, in conclusion, the summary here, in this lesson, we learned about the different jobs in ancient Egypt, which you can see here again in this pyramid. All right, thank you.